So, Renato, does the judge in Georgia throwing out three more of the counts against Trump and two defendants even matter?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet.
So, do you remember with the Manhattan case? They had called it the zombie case because it was like dormant and then kind of, came back to life or whatever. Um, I I don't know what kind of analogy or metaphor we would use for the Georgia case, but it's sort of like I forget that it exists,
It's
and
like it,
it's not quite a
yeah,
zombie. I mean, it's not quite dead.
it's like a horror movie where like you shot the killer, the antagonist, and like he's got all his buckshot, and maybe he's got an axe coming out of his leg, but he's still coming at you. And it's not like he's coming from the dead, but it's just he's goes so slow that he
Yeah,
may never reach you. But it's like, oh, hit him again. Let's like shoot him again. That
yeah,
sort of thing, right?
yeah. It's sort of like it feels like an inconsequential case at this point because of everything that has happened. Now, just to recap, just so we're, because I feel like we're in, different episodes of different TV series or something. I mean, when we last left this indictment, um, this case, Judge Scott McAfee had ruled that DA Fonnie Willis was not disqualified from prosecuting this case as long as the special prosecutor she appointed, Nathan Wade, was no longer on the case. And then he stepped down. But uh, the defendants, Trump and other defendants, appealed that decision. So the proceedings in this case have basically been paused while that appeal it goes up, and I believe that oral argument is being heard on December 5th in a Georgia appellate court.
Right. And I think the how much that matters is really up for debate, right? It makes the whole case. It puts the whole case in a. That was why I use the analogy in a horror movie where it's like, okay, they're in the cabin and they're just like, well, we've already stopped this guy, haven't we? Oh, he comes back. He comes back, but like at this point, it may not matter, right? If since it's after November, I mean, it would be the amount of time it would even be alive prior to inauguration if Trump won, very minimal.
So the judge had previously quashed several other charges, and I think we talked about that in a previous episode, Renato. And these were, remember, this was about the solicitation of public officials to lie, and the defendants argued that the indictment didn't charge with enough specificity, I guess, what the lie was. Like they couldn't prepare an adequate defense or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, anyway, so those were thrown out, and some of those related to Trump. But the charges here that he most recently ruled on related to the perjury charges in this sprawling indictment.
Yeah, and this was that's a very specific ruling, and there were actually broader challenges that were raised. And essentially, it's worth noting that there were arguments that the defendants raised suggesting that huge swaths of the indictment should be dismissed, arguing that essentially the supremacy clause of the Constitution means that these state counts can't go forward. In other words, because federal law supersedes state law, that the fact that there's elections are overseen to a certain extent, like certification, for example, of electoral votes is overseen in a federal procedure, that means that you can't essentially have any state election, laws, criminal election laws, which I think is a difficult argument for them to make.
Right. And I mean, that really was going to always be a tension that was going to come up in some way with this case, right? Because, um, it kind of gets to how much power the states have to prosecute this conduct that's happening in the context of a federal election. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
some of this tension also came up in the Manhattan case, also, when we were wondering what the theory of that case is. So, yeah, so break it down. Like, what was the court saying here?
Yeah, essentially, I would say it's to the Electoral Count Act argument. Essentially, what the judge noted is that if you look at the text of the Electoral Count Act, it doesn't appear to preempt state laws. In other words, it's not like it's trying to take control of elections, which are traditionally in this country administered by the states. In fact, that's, I believe, the system contemplated by the United States Constitution. And he noted, in fact, that even when there was a recent effort to amend the Electoral Count Act, that the Congress chose not to make a change at that point. And so I think the judge wisely and correctly decided that argument was long shot at best.
Right. But then he does zone in on these three charges, and these involve the filing of false documents, so basically perjury.
Right.
And basically this is really about charging people for perjury in state court for, I guess, the false document is about a federal proceeding.
Yeah. And what he essentially just made this decision based on is a very old case. I think it's from 1899,
Yeah.
which is really something. But essentially, a case suggesting that the federal law that prohibits false statements in federal proceedings supersedes state law analogs to that. And that's like a long-standing precedent. And I just, for everyone's benefit, when we're talking about false statements, you've probably been familiar with us having conversations about false statement charges in other federal cases, and that's because it's a very commonly charged statute, 18 U.S.C. 1001, which criminalizes willfully making false statements in connection with a federal proceeding.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. Like, he quotes from that case and basically says Loney's central holding concerns the federal court's ability to police its own proceedings with respect to statements made under oath. And so the idea is that if perjury in this context is about protecting the integrity of the process, this is a process crime, that the process we're really concerned about here is a federal one, and the state can't kind of intervene and punish that themselves.
That's right. That's right. And I think that that's a long-standing precedent. And just for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, it can make some sense to you. In other words, when we look at the January 6th lawsuit in D.C. that Jack Smith is handling, and that actually lawsuit, but federal criminal indictment, there are charges relating to all sorts of falsehoods that were being told there. And the point is, if Jack Smith wants to charge a particular false statement, he has the ability to do so. And this is a way of essentially preventing, states from essentially replicating that at the state level. And that's a part of a criminal law that is different from topic to topic. In other words, there's some areas where the feds are the ones policing, right, on certain types of crimes, and they're the only ones who are. There are also some crimes that can be charged federally or in the state, like let's say narcotics. There's narcotics offenses that are federal and state. Sometimes the same transaction could be punished in either. And then there's some that are uniquely state crimes. Murdering most people, not like the president or something, or murdering most of like people like you and me, Asha, is a state crime, usually not a federal crime. But here, this is essentially a decision, very long-standing decision that these sorts of crimes should be handled federally.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting because the judge touches on it in his ruling. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, depending on the context. There is a concept called dual sovereignty, where the federal government and the state government are separate sovereigns. So even in the case of murder, Renato, I mean, if you'll remember um, this was dealing with two states, but the DC sniper, for example, was prosecuted in two different states, and I'm sure you have examples of federal government and state government prosecuting for the same thing. But I think that and that gets to kind of this idea of whose interests are being vindicated. And I think the supremacy argument is sort of like this is a federal interest, like this. It's not something that is really within the jurisdiction of the state to actually punish.
Yeah, I mean there are, and it's good that you bring it up. That's why I alluded to a moment ago. There's a lots of crimes in which they could fall under one or the other. There's a whole policy that the Justice Department has called a pettit policy about when you can or can't basically prosecute people on both federal and state for the same thing, because the law is so can often be so permissive towards prosecutors about those cases.
Yeah.
Here, I think you could make an argument. You know, there were arguments that the prosecutors had as to why this didn't fall under this preemption. But I think this judge has been a very down the road, down the middle, very careful judge. That's been my reaction to him. He's a
Yeah.
Republican, but he's more of a mainstream Republican, I would say.
Yeah, and you can see that in his ruling. I mean, he really, he entertains the arguments that the Trump and the other defendants put up, and he just, he doesn't buy into them for some of the counts. So I guess this gets to the main question that we asked, like, do we care? I mean, that's all the legal jargon and slicing and dicing, which is sort of interesting if you're a legal nerd. And yes, it did have the ultimate impact of quashing 3 of these perjury charges. But I mean, this is really a sprawling indictment, and it seems like the core of it, which was the RICO charge, is still intact. And that was kind of the main piece of it, right?
Right. And I mean, you alluded to this a second ago, Asha. I mean, I feel like Fonnie Willis threw the book at Trump. It's a very different approach. Like, we've talked about this in the past. Jack Smith having this very careful, narrow approach that he took, only charging Trump and not charging others, and so on. I think, on the flip side, um, you know, uh, as to this case with that Fonnie Willis brought, there's so many charges that she brought. You could lose half of them, and she'd still have a lot to go forward on. And here, whoever it's going to be who's going to be taking this forward, which stay tuned. If it goes forward, and I guess that's another stay tuned. I think they're going to have plenty to throw at the defendants in this case.
So, what do you think? This is one question that I'm interested to get your take on. So, I understand that at least one of these quash charges was one that Kenneth Cheeseborough pleaded guilty to. And it may have been more, but I know at least one. In other words, he's pleaded guilty already to a charge that's now been thrown out under the Supremacy Clause. So what does he get to do?
I mean, he could try to get that out undone, and that maybe have some value to him. But was that the only count that he pled to? I don't think so.
No,
Right?
he pled. I think he pled to like 4 counts. I mean,
Right.
there's so much happening in this case. But I
You
think
know,
but so it was not the only one. In other words, getting rid of it does not change, fundamentally, like, his
right.
guilt.
So if this wasn't Kenneth Chesebro, but this was like random person, Jane Doe, and she had pled guilty to a bunch of counts, and she got a very light sentence on it, right? Cheesebro's not, it's not like Cheesebro's serving hard time in a supermax prison or something. So, and got a very light sentence. Most people wouldn't even bother. There's just no point in it. It's irrelevant whether you're convicted on 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 counts. But Cheesebro obviously is a high profile case. Being able to say, that they've done something wrong here might have an impact. And he's a lawyer, so or he was. I don't know what
I
his
don't know.
status, what the status is of his law license. But the point is, he may have some interest in doing that. But I feel it is relatively academic. And I don't know the specific procedural vehicle you would do in the circumstance. It's very unusual to have a charge thrown out after you plead guilty to it. But there are times where people, for example, like a common issue is when the Supreme Court makes a decision that narrows the scope of certain laws. There's a discussion as to whether or not that decision is retroactive, and whether it can be applied to defendants who've been imprisoned under a prior understanding of what the law was. And usually the Supreme Court is explicitly makes a judgment about that because it spawns waves of litigation otherwise. In this case, it'll be interesting to see if he cares.
Yeah. Well, the cheese stands alone.
Indeed. So, Asha, this is not the only case going on in Georgia. And in fact, I mean, I think an argument can be made that the case that we're going to talk about now is far more important at this stage than the criminal prosecution of Donald Trump.
Yeah, you and I went back and forth on which one we wanted to make the A block because the one that most people know about and is sort of sexier, I guess, is the Georgia indictment because we've been talking about it now for how long have we been talking about it? For a year and a half?
Feels like it, yeah.
Yeah, a year. Yeah. But yes, so there's this other lawsuit that has been filed against the Fulton County Election Board.
Right, by the Democratic Party. And I will note that when you and I were researching this case, it was amazing how much litigation has popped up around the board. And, it's interesting because there's another lawsuit that another group filed. There's an ethics complaint against the 3 Republican members of the board. And for backdrop, the Georgia Election Board essentially oversees the administration of elections in Georgia and certifies the electoral votes. Very important. And one thing that I think is an aspect of Trump's attempts to undermine our democracy that is not focused on enough is the way in which he's so distrust amongst his followers in the system and has encouraged them to take over local and state organs of election organs, essentially, in an attempt to essentially change the results of future elections under the guise of fighting fraud, of non-fraud that occurred in the last election.
Yeah, I mean, I've made the Titanic analogy before in terms of, we have, I think, certain guardrails that protect against like someone being able to, illegally win an election, I guess, right? Like it's and they have systematically broken down, but the last one is our system of federalism. And I think what what we really learned in the 2020 election, because we focused so much on the federal government and, at the national level, is how much the local officials save democracy. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Like people who went in, they did their jobs, you know, um, And here's the thing is that the Trump and his allies learned their lesson. And that has been, what they realized is we have to, this whole decentralized, diffusion of power is something that stands in our way. And we have to reverse that and basically co-opt all of these things. And they have slowly been doing that. Now, I think they haven't been entirely successful. If I recall, there were a bunch of MAGA candidates running for Secretary of State positions. And I think most of them lost. But yeah, that's an even higher level than here. So if for a major county, if you have, lackeys in place that can muck up the results, you can really cause a lot of problems. And I think here they changed the rules, right? After 2020 to give the board power to, for example, I think like gather evidence of irregularities and do all kinds of stuff that can end up causing shenanigans if that power is abused.
Correct. So there's 5 people on the Georgia election board, and there's now 3 MAGA members. And essentially, there's been a lot of challenges back and forth regarding some of their changes. But at this point, one of the things is, the certification process for electoral votes is typically perfunctory. Like, unless there's some real challenge, like, oh my goodness, the election is being decided by 500 votes or something along those lines, people aren't really that focused on this stuff. But now what's going to happen is I think that they have to conduct a quote reasonable inquiry, if I recall correctly, after the election and before certification. There's no definition of that term, but this essentially gives them authority and in fact an imperative to dig in to individual results. And I believe they can actually go to specific counties and get their results and look through them. And you can imagine a scenario in which the 3 MAGA members of the board are scouring the state looking for something that they can to find 11,000 votes, which last time around was the deciding factor in that state's electoral votes. And you had an honest Republican, Brad Raffensperger, who refused to do that.
So this board actually has power over all of the counties then?
It has the ability to obtain evidence from those counties. I mean, I believe it has some level of control because that's what their rules purport, at least that they can obtain this evidence from other counties. And then they have to decide whether to certify results. Now, I think you could imagine a scenario. I will just say, Asha, looks like if this is a close election, which it very well may be, that the election could come down to Pennsylvania and Georgia. And here, you could imagine a situation in which the election in Georgia is close. And of course, Governor Kemp and Brad Raffensperger, I think, proved last time that they weren't willing to do something dishonest to and help Trump win, even though I think he made very pointed requests for them to do so. But here you have independent folks who are MAGA Republicans who, will take it. I think it's fair to say will take a different view of that.
So then who would have the ultimate power, I guess, is my question. I mean, would it not rest ultimately with the Secretary of State, or is this board independent? I guess I'm trying to understand where does the buck stop, I guess, and who would finally be able, like, if you had a reasonable person as a Secretary of State, would that offer any check?
I'm not sure. I think it's possible, but I think at the very least, this group would potentially call the results into question. Let's put it that way.
And it's a good point to make that, now that I'm thinking through it, that even if it's ultimately like resolved by somebody who can call it correctly, I think when we look back to 2020, it doesn't even matter what the real result is as long as you can call it into doubt, right? The phone call to Brad Raffensperger to look for 11,871 votes was less about him actually ginning up the 11,871 votes, or finding them or creating them or something, but to start the investigation, or to publicly state that there was some doubt, and we are looking into it so that the narrative could be substantiated, and pause the count, I guess, is the point. So in some ways, it's you don't even need people to have power over the final outcome. You only need people to simply start creating doubt over the process itself,
Could
even
you
if it's for a
imagine?
short time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, I agree that, if you could imagine a scenario in which the Georgia Elections Board votes 3-2, that the election is got serious irregularities or whatever they end up saying, I think regardless of how that all pans out, it will be latched onto by Trump to say that, hey, I didn't
Mhm.
really lose. I'm going to run again in 2028, or whatever he wants to do, whatever he wants to accomplish for himself.
Yeah. It's all about perception.
Indeed. And there is a trial coming up on October 1st, that will determine whether or not these rules can go forward. They've been challenged by the Democratic Party. Given, Asha, that the January 6th case isn't going to trial and there's not going to be an evidentiary hearing, and the sentencing has been postponed for Trump, which I think a lot of us thought was coming, and you and I kind of predicted that. And then, obviously the Fulton County case is on ice. The Mar-a-Lago case is on ice at this point. This is potentially the most impactful trial on this election.
Yes, for sure. So we'll keep an eye on it and report back.
Indeed.
So Renato, did you watch the debate on Tuesday night?
I was too busy eating my dog, so uh, no. In all seriousness, I'm in the middle of prepping for a trial that starts on Tuesday, so I watched part of it, but I couldn't watch the entire thing in real time. Unfortunately, I watched most of it.
So I feel like, I mean, I was on a high for a couple of days because I think Kamala Harris did so well. I think handled herself beautifully, laid the traps, and I think effectively eviscerated Trump with, in a weird way, like by also showing, like, kind of being empathetic and compassionate, like at least she presented that way. Like my favorite line of hers when she talked about his inability to accept the 2020 election results, and she's like, and he's clearly having a lot of trouble accepting that fact, and she just had this look of like pity really on Trump. But since then I have been really frustrated that this the contrast could not be greater. How are we in a situation where somebody is talking about eating dogs and cats is like literally neck and neck with like an obviously qualified candidate? Like why is this happening?
Well, I mean, first of all, the what was it, 67 million people who tuned in
Mm-hmm.
are probably mostly people who are so highly motivated that they made up their minds already. I think it is telling. I don't know if you had the same experience that I did, but I have scanned social media over the last day or two, and it's interesting that even the Trump supporters, I don't think he won. At
Nobody
least
thinks he won. He didn't win.
no, I know that, but I'm noting that they have enough. It's interesting because they don't deny their eyes what they're seeing in their eyes before
Yeah.
them. They recognize he lost, but they've got their own whatever reasons, for why they did the border or whatever they're going to say. I just think that attitudes are already very entrenched. The people who support Trump really support him. And that may be 44 to 45% of the electorate in a election in which there's going to be third parties and so forth on certain ballots. And so 44, 45% can be a lot if the winning percentage is 48. or something along those lines. But I also think that we live in a society in which most of the persuadable voters are getting their news from like TikTok videos or Facebook or something like that. They're only seeing little clips. And while the dogs and cats thing, I mean, I made a joke about that. That is, I think, very notable and bizarre. The average person who's looking at that in YouTube videos going to think, oh, it's taken out of context or whatever. I don't know, but I'm not a professional psychologist, but it is really something, and it's the world in which we live, the country in which we live. And I think it is the country in which we are going to continue to live, even if Donald Trump disappeared tomorrow.
I saw a Twitter post from a Canadian who said, "In Canada, this is what we see," and it said it had like a blue bar, kind of one of those pole bars that have like blue and red, like puppies for everyone, 50.1%. Diarrhea every day for 4 years, 49.9%. So it's like,
Yeah.
kind of they're it, and I totally like that's what made me wonder, like that really is what this is. Like it's so obvious what's better, and yet we're so close, and here we are dealing with someone who is talking about immigrants eating cats and dogs.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I will say it really, from my perspective, I think that even a loss in this election would not necessarily change 44 to 45% of Americans' view of Donald Trump. I mean, he could continue to be a force in American politics.
So let's remember though, Renato, because I don't want to I think this we're really talking about 30% of the country, because the 40 something percent of like our actual voters.
Okay, that's fair. But, I think that's another point. And I mean, maybe that's actually profound, though, when you think of it that way, though, Asha. Isn't really the issue that
Yes.
half the country didn't vote and that they're not involved and they're just like, look, I'm going to make money and support my family. I get it. Everyone's got a lot on their plates, right? You got to raise your kids and make ends meet and all that. But you would think you could take a day off or an hour out of your day to vote. But I think a lot of people just they don't think it matters. They feel that the system doesn't impact them. I think a lot of people, one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, I think that drives home why this election, like turnout is everything. And to kind of take it back to that second block, the margin, it's not victory isn't enough. The margin has to be incontrovertible.
That's right. And I think people who are confident because of a 2 point lead nationally or 3 point lead nationally needs to realize that would potentially be running up the numbers in big cities in states that the Democrats are only going to win. So I think you need a substantial lead nationally in order to win states like Georgia or Pennsylvania. And then, as you said, it needs to be close and not close. It can't be close enough such that shenanigans could potentially impact the outcome. And there's already a lot of things nationwide that do impact
Mm-hmm.
how people vote.
Yeah. We do not want this case to end up at the Supreme Court.
Absolutely not.